Hello Fear Seekers, and welcome back to the channel. We're entering further into the spooky season, the time of year when ghosts and ghouls have no trouble letting themselves be known. And that means that what I'm about to say next was, really, inevitable. Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, allegedly true, Halloween horror stories. Now, this marks only the second video of the week. We usually would have 3. But this week, I've been preparing a special surprise for you guys. No need to worry. Next week we will be back to our regular amount of scheduled uploads, +1. But anyways, that's enough of that. Now without further ado, sit back, keep your guard up and your treats close, and get ready to ferment your fears. I had this friend when I was growing up that I was pretty close with. I'll call him Carl for the purpose of this story. I recall meeting him when we were in the 1st grade. I even swear I can remember the way that the schoolroom looked and such. Carl and I became fast friends, mostly because we were unlike most of the other boys in the school. Particularly, we both liked playing with both boys' and girls' toys for some reason. It was hard to find boys or girls who were like this when I was younger, so it was just natural, it seemed, that he and I would be friends. Throughout the years growing up, Carl and I did just about everything together. He would always come to my birthday party as the first person to come and the last person to leave. My parents would give him a ride whenever we had one of our birthday parties at a Showbiz Pizza or a Chuck E. Cheese. I seem to remember having been to both of them at some point. We were a very close 2-person friendship, and even when we played things like hide and seek with other kids, we still didn't connect with the other children the way we connected with each other. As we got around 13 years old, things began to change a little bit. And yeah, I know what you were thinking. Boys go through puberty and they begin liking girls more than they like each other. But that is not what I am talking about. Yeah, we talked about girls and absolutely had an interest in girls, but there were much deeper and much stranger changes that Carl began going through. We both started watching horror television and horror movies when we were really young. Our parents wouldn't have been happy about it if they had known, so we kept it really secret. Often, we would spend the night at his house, in his bedroom, and wait for his parents to go to sleep. Since it was a sleepover, we were allowed to stay up pretty late. Oh, and I don't want you to think that Carl's later behavior had anything to do with watching horror movies. I truly don't believe horror movies, comics, TV shows, and things of that nature make people behave in a certain way. I needed to get that out there before I continued. The first thing that I noticed with Carl is that he started playing little practical jokes on his siblings. Just some minor things. But he always got a big kick out of it when one of them would fall for one of his tricks. He seemed to get a real rush out of it or something, and then he started to up the ante, so to speak. Playing little innocent practical jokes on his family developed into playing jokes on his classmates as well. But it was never like a joke you play on someone and afterward you all have a good laugh about it. Carl was not just into playing jokes. He was also into doing it without getting caught. He never wanted anyone to know that it was indeed he who had done the joke. Here are just a few of the things I remember him doing. In school, we used to have these desks that you would lift the lid of the desk up and there was this compartment inside. He had gotten a garter snake and he placed it in the desk of another student. He actually got to school very early, so he would be the first one in the classroom, so he could leave before anyone knew. The student had opened his desk and began yelling, causing everyone else to panic. Carl would react in the manner that the other students did. He did this to draw attention away from himself. And it worked. No one ever suspected him of anything, and he never got in trouble for anything. You name it. Tax on the teacher's chair. Stealing her attendance book. He once rubbed the inside of every pair of his older brother's underwear with icy hot before letting them dry and putting them back in his drawer. And just a lot of things like that. I thought that it had reached its apex, though, when, in between classes once, in a crowded staircase, he tripped a kid who fell down the stairs and broke his arm. This was in high school, and the kid was a jock who pretty much lost his ability to play football after that. But it was when Carl was 16 that things took a turn that I would have never seen coming. We were still old enough to go trick-or-treating in my area. Personally, I had stopped going when I was 12. I just felt weird walking around begging for candy at that age. Carl had stopped too. But it wasn't unusual to see teenagers up to 18 still going around asking for candy. But, age 16, Carl wanted to go trick-or-treating. He insisted that I get a costume and that I go with him. I really didn't want to. I mean, for one thing, I knew the guy. If he had suddenly wanted to do this again after 4 years, he had to have a reason for it. And that reason was most likely not a good one. Still, the guy was my friend, so I got myself a costume. He insisted that it was a costume in which no one would be able to tell who we were. I went as Freddy Krueger and bought myself a high-end rubber mask. Carl's costume was even more concealing. He actually wore boots with lifts in them to make himself look taller. He wore a Michael Myers-like outfit, but with some sort of welder's mask that covered his whole head. It was a weird costume, but it definitely hid who he was. I was wondering why Carl wanted to wear such an odd costume. When he told me why, I literally shivered. A chill went down my spine. Carl had heard about the case of the guy who had killed his son with poisoned pixie stick. I mean, back then, we all believed that people put things into candy and that it was always a smart thing to check all the candy before eating it. But other than that one case, you never heard of anything on the news about it. You never heard about candy with a razor blade in it or anything like that. Carl wanted to change that. He had taken Tootsie Rolls and inserted thin pins into them lengthwise. He had then wrapped them back up. He was planning on putting them into a bucket and giving them out to kids while we were out trick-or-treating. I told Carl that was a crazy idea and some kid could get killed. His excuse was that no parents let their children eat Halloween candy without checking it first. Not only was the wrapper twisted back on in a terrible fashion, the head of the pin was obviously sticking out of the end of the Tootsie Roll. I really didn't understand the point if he was making it obvious. And he simply said he wanted to scare the parents and kids into thinking someone simply wanted to hurt them. But he was sure no one would actually get hurt. It was the most insane thing I had ever heard a person tell me in my entire life. I mean, not only was the premise of his plan sickening beyond all measure, it wasn't foolproof either. All it took was one parent not checking one piece of candy, and that would make Carl a murderer. The two of us argued about it, and he was pretty angry at me for not wanting to go along with it. But it was only when I told him that if he did it, I would have to reveal him as the person who had done it, that he finally decided not to. We decided just to remain in and watch movies that night. A lot of you may be wondering why I didn't just leave. Honestly, I felt that if I did, Carl would go and do the plan on his own. I just couldn't take the chance that he would risk any child's life like that. Others may be wondering why I didn't call the police. Well, he backed off and wasn't going to do it. Even though he had done some amazingly bad things in recent years, I still believed him when he told me he wouldn't do it. The strangest thing is that Carl never seemed to have any resentment toward me about thwarting him. He continued to treat me exactly like he had treated me before this had happened. I had a hard time seeing him the same way, though. And although we continued to hang out until after we graduated high school, I didn't keep in touch with him after we went away for college. I have absolutely no idea whatever happened to him. I just hope that he never did anything this bad to anyone in real life. You know, when someone discusses a loved one's passing, they talk about the signs, the premonitions, and the presents? I lost my dad just a couple weeks ago, and I had all of these. Just 2 weeks before his passing, I visited him and we had a big family get-together with dinner. My dad and I had a difficult relationship in some ways because he liked to keep pretty isolated, or maybe I just didn't visit enough. I'm not sure of which now. Anyway, at this visit, he had gotten a haircut and a shave, and he looked healthier and more presentable than he had in at least 2 years. I brought a dish I was sure he'd have nothing to do with, and he ate it with me and said how delicious it was. I put on the Eagles and we sang Take It Easy. At the end of the night, he let me hug and kiss him goodbye, which he has never done in his life. I told my dad I was moving to the coast to be near the ocean. He asked if he could come see me when I got there, as he never had been to the ocean. I promised he could, despite my shock at the idea he would even come, and we spent time dreaming of how wonderful it was going to be when he came. Afterward, my husband said it was the best visit we ever had with my dad. It was. I was really looking forward to seeing him on his birthday, November 2nd, not knowing I would not get the chance to ever see him again, losing him 2 days beforehand. Later in the week, my husband and I went for a walk, and he asked why I cared so much to research my family tree. I told him how a couple years back I had finally done my dad's tree, and all the things I learned, including the very interesting story I shared with my husband about how my simple father was actually a talented musician, and I literally sang the only song I ever remember him writing as we walked. It was about one of the last prisoners executed at the Dawn jail, who I'm pretty sure Dad named me after. It's a sad song about the father of the prisoner attending and mourning his son's hanging. My husband got very quiet and noted how unusually deep and somber the conversation had turned. I agreed, but it felt right to talk about at the time. A week later, my daughter said that my dad had tried to call her, but she was unavailable. I don't think he's ever tried to call her before, so I tried to call him back, but his number came up out of service. I have no explanation for how this occurred within 30 minutes of him calling my daughter. I had a bad feeling, so I tried to call my mom, who is his ex-wife, but he was still good friends with and lived close by. No answer. I told myself to let it go and stop worrying. Early Halloween morning, my husband was up late as usual working on some papers at a local cafe. I woke at 12:24 a.m. and called him anxious and asking where he was and when he'd be back. He accused me of behaving strangely and said he was where he always was and would be back soon. I woke again at 1:50 a.m. after what could be described as a panic and called him again to discover he was downstairs in our house. I was disoriented, and he accused me again of acting very weird. I wrote it off and went to sleep, barely remembering anything of it by morning. This has never happened before. The following day, I had scheduled off work for an appointment which turned out to be very lucky, because I was still in bed instead of being at my desk 90 minutes away where I normally would have been when my brother called and told me Dad had died the night before. I left quickly with my husband to go to where Dad and my family live. In the car, I started crying. My husband gently asked what I was thinking about. I said, "When I woke up and I called you last night, I can already tell you that's when he went." I was right. We got there and learned Dad died at 12:25 a.m. Halloween morning. My mom divorced my dad over 30 years ago. He never did divorce her and never loved another. He should have died on his apartment floor alone, but she came to visit him that afternoon and insisted on bringing him to the hospital after seeing he was unwell. He was admitted and stabilized after arrhythmia. She told him she loved him and she would let us know he was in the hospital, and that she would visit in the morning. That wily old bird passed away just a couple minutes after the love of his life left his bedside, and I'm certain that was deliberate. For the next several days, Take It Easy played on a continuous loop in my head. I thought I was going insane, and I couldn't make it stop. After the funeral, after my eulogy at the end of which I played Take It Easy, it finally did. I had spent the days asking for a sign from Dad that he was okay. I now believed this endless, repetitive music in my head was his goodbye to me. I'm still going to move next to the ocean, Dad, and when I do, I promise I'll take you with me. One last thing. I found an envelope of cash in Dad's apartment when I went to empty it with my sister. Not much money, but obviously took a long time for him to save, as $4,500 is a lot for a man as poor as he was. I split it with my 2 siblings, and I immediately took some of my share to get a tattoo. Of course, it is to remember my father, and it is at my right shoulder where he always was in life, and most certainly is now. It was like he put it there for us to find. It was under a pile of laundry on his bed, of all strange places, in an envelope, wrapped in a bag. When I was 14 years old, I went to a church gathering on Halloween night that was called Hallelujah Night, a Christian alternative to Halloween. My family and I would get there in the afternoon since we'd volunteer to help set up the booths, cakewalk, candy barrels, etc. But I was mostly there to get first dibs on all of the candy. After I finished helping with the usual booth I helped set up, I took a seat on a bench near the main sanctuary. It was my favorite place to sit at since I could see the entire lot and, most of all, the beautiful sunset. I pulled out my PSP and was scrolling through some music I had on it when some guy approached me and started a conversation. I've never been a people person, so usually when things like this happen, I keep the conversation short. However, this guy had this weird type of warmth to him, as if he was a friend of mine. As the conversation carried on, I started to ask him if he was new because I hadn't seen him before. He told me that he had been going to this church for years, but left after an incident happened. When I asked him about the incident, he paused, looked at me, and said that there's some things people pick up on that they know aren't normal. Also, that you should never get curious about things that you know you should leave alone. I had a sort of confused look on my face, since I didn't know what he meant at the time. The guy noticed it and said that I would understand once I got older. I looked down at my PSP that I had in my hand still and looked back up at the guy, and he was gone. I looked around and couldn't find him anywhere in the lot. There were just a few people still prepping for Hallelujah Night. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward to a few months later. I was sitting in the main sanctuary before leaving to do my usual volunteer work on the upper floor. The upper floor was a daycare area for kids. So at the end of service, volunteers would escort the children downstairs and I would go into each room, shutting off the lights and making sure no children were still up there. I'll never forget getting up to leave to do my usual duties when the pastor started talking about an upcoming funeral. I looked at the big screens on each side of the main sanctuary, and the face of that of the man I was talking to during Hallelujah Night was there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To this day, it still seems unreal. I was beyond shook as I made my way out of the main sanctuary into the flights of big stairs as I went to the upper floor. Once I made it up to the upper floor, another volunteer had confirmed that all the children were escorted downstairs. She noticed that I had looked sort of pale from seeing what I saw in the main sanctuary, and asked me if I was okay. I told her it was nothing and proceeded to cut off all the lights on the upper floor as she left downstairs. The upper floor was like a giant hallway with doors on each side and a door at the end of the hallway with a giant window in it. When I came to the last room at the end of the hall, I would always leave the blinds on that big window open since the light always illuminated the dark hallway and made me feel less scared. But as I left the room, I remember feeling panicked. It was suddenly freezing, and I felt like if I left that room, something was waiting for me in the darkened hallway that was going to jump out and attack me. As I'm trying to muster up the courage to just run for it, I see a small head of a child peek out a couple of doors down. It stayed there for a few seconds, and then put its head back into the room. I immediately called out to the child, but no answer. The fear I had a minute ago was gone as I left the last room to go through the hallway, now illuminated finally by the moon. I made it to the other room in a matter of seconds, cutting on the lights and searching the entire room for the child I saw. But no one was there. I started getting spooked again as I cut off the lights in that room. Then one of the most terrifying things I have ever seen and experienced happened. As I was leaving the room, I looked back at the last room's window which illuminated the hallway and, out of nowhere, a massive black mass moved in front of the window, almost covering up the light completely. It was darker than black, and its outline as it covered the light seemed to be moving. It was enough to frighten me into running for my life. I ran the rest of the hallway and down the stairs. I was stopped by one of the ushers who told me not to run, but when I told him what I saw, he looked at me as if I was crazy. Once church was over, I told my parents about what had happened on the ride home, and they ended up not believing me since they're skeptics. But I know what I saw that day, and it's something that still scares me to this very day. I should preface this by saying that Halloween this year was pretty uneventful. I'm not sure if I'm happy with that or sad, but last year was very interesting, and it happened in part because I did something stupid. I am from a Celtic family. My parents are both descended from American colonist families. My mother's family for sure being of the group that came to the Americas to carry on their Celtic traditions in peace. So I grew up being very interested in Celtic tradition and our more pagan roots, even though my parents were very devout Protestants. They allowed me the interest, mainly because they liked connecting more with their roots. So as I'm sure many of you have read in the common Samhain articles that make their rounds every year since the internet began, there are a few games and practices that Celts participated in on Samhain every year. The whole holiday is about playing with ghosts and making contact to ask questions, always in a respectful manner. In my household and my wife's household, most commonly you would always light a fire, inside or outside depending on where you were gathered, and sometimes leave out candy or other goodies on your doorstep after trick-or-treating was over, or bury them in the planter area next to the front door. The burying, I've found, is key for the distinction that you're leaving a treat for the dead. Herein lies my screw-up. It was near the end of the night. Trick-or-treating had ended a little while ago, and I realized I hadn't put anything out as we got back and went inside like usual. So I went to the kitchen and looked for something quick to put out. I prefer grabbing apples for this task. A lot of the traditional Samhain games and customs are described as being done with an apple, bobbing for apples, the peel game, etc. So it feels prescient to use an apple when leaving treats for the dead, as they clearly seem to have an affinity for them. I look into the bowl that sits on the nook table and realize that I hadn't bought new apples since I had picked them myself. And though they weren't rotten, you could still see some soft spots beginning to form. I thought to myself that this shouldn't be a really big deal, as more than likely it would just be dug up by an animal later, so I grabbed the best looking one of the bunch, which I still probably wouldn't have eaten without some considerable paring. I stepped out the front door and down the stairs of my house, grabbed the gardening spade sticking out from one of my wife's planters, and scooped a quick hole out in the dirt next to the bottom stair, tossing in the apple and recovering it. I don't know why I still buried the thing. I should have just left it on the stoop, but it was done, so I went back inside and promptly forgot about it. Later that night, the kids were in bed, and my wife and I were watching Trick or Treat, our all-time favorite movie to watch Halloween night. It must have been near midnight when we heard 3 knocks on our front door. Our home is not a huge house, but it is a pre-Great Depression colonial, so it retains some key features that, though 100 years old, are more upscale features on new homes today. This includes our heavy wood front door and brass door knocker, which is inordinately loud for what it is. It's quite easy to overdo it when you use the door knocker. You can typically hear it from upstairs with minimal effort put in on the part of the knocker. The weird thing was that these knocks were not that. They were even and just loud enough for us to hear from our spot near the foyer on the couch. The unusual quietness of the door knocker made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. My wife and I froze and looked at each other. Her level of belief is slightly higher than mine, though not by much, but she's still usually quick to explain things away. Still, it was a little too uncanny. "Do you think there are still any trick-or-treaters out?" It had been a mild Halloween compared with other years, so she was wondering, as was I, if any wayward trick-or-treaters had simply decided to try their luck on the way home. I had probably forgotten to turn off the porch light. My first thought, if I'm being honest, was older kids more interested in tricks than treats. My inclination was to ignore it. Let's just ignore it. I'm not interested in answering that. As if in answer to my statement, 3 more knocks came from the door. A little louder this time. I got up and went to the foyer quietly, as I had a bit of the shivers now. My wife, who was also a little on edge at this point, whispered as loudly as she could behind me, "Tell me you aren't answering that door." I assured her I was just going to look as I went. It's only 10 or so feet to the foyer from where we were seated by the fireplace and TV. I stepped into the foyer. I say foyer, but it's really just a small entryway with a coat closet and a door on each side separating the front door and coat closet from the rest of the house. Useful as a kind of airlock during really hot or cold times of the year, but most of the time the house side door just hangs open, as it was now. Right as I was crossing onto the tile that designates the area near the front door, the knock sounded again, loudly. I jumped mid-step and then made the last 2 steps to the small eye-level window in the old door. There was no one standing there. The window doesn't offer great visibility, but with some maneuvering it's possible to see the whole stoop in front of the door, which is what I was doing now. Nobody was there. If it were someone knocking and then running, I'd have probably caught them in the window to the left of the foyer entrance, or my wife would have seen them outside the living room window to the right, which I was asking her about quietly as I was looking. I commented when she answered no. The only way there's someone there right now is if they're pressed up against the door just under me. My wife asked quickly, "You aren't going to open it, are you?" "Absolutely not," I answered. I still had that feeling that something uncanny was going on, and living person or not on the other side of the door, opening it was a bad idea. I went back and pressed my head into the windows on either side of the foyer/doorway protrusion on the front of the house to see if I could see anything on the front step against the doorway. Even though I could get a pretty good angle on it, within about a foot of actually seeing straight across the front door, I still couldn't see anything. I went back to the couch, relaxing a little. My wife was very suspicious of the knocks. She seemed to be leaning towards the visitor being not of the living, and told me as much, but we didn't have any knocks after that, and decided to call it a night after the movie ended. Fast forward to a few days later. My wife had been complaining about catching the slightest hint of a dead animal smell when arriving or leaving at the house, and a couple nights we had received phantom knocks at the door. That same light tapping of the door knocker. I had even opened the front door once, but not the storm door, to find no one there. Then a cloud of gnats showed up. They swarmed just over the end of the flower bed, across from the door and at the end of the path to the driveway, away from where I had buried the apple. They didn't leave the one little area of the air over the flower bed, not even after it snowed pretty heavily. I was amazed they were even still alive considering the season and temperature, opposite what should be amenable to them around here. All of these little things were beginning to add up, and I had come to the possible conclusion before my wife. I had done a little bit of research to find out if gnats were associated as heralding a certain entity. I didn't really find anything. My wife began to get really creeped out by the knocking. It had been a couple weeks since Halloween, and she had heard a knock on the door when I was at work. She asked me why I thought this was going on and what I thought might stop it. I then told her I had buried the apple this year. I also told her, because it was bothering me a little now, that it was less fresh than I'd have liked. Let's just say she was a little less than pleased to hear this. Her response went a little something like this. "So you offered rotten fruit to anything that happened to be passing by on Halloween night? What a stupid idea! What kind of things do you think prefer spoiled treats?" I assured her at this point that it was still a very edible apple, but this did not dissuade her from her outrage. "That doesn't matter. You probably attracted a demon or bad fairy." Side note. My wife was referring here to the fairies as in the AOSC. She's second-generation Irish-American and believes more in the old folklore than I do sometimes. Frankly, though, I thought she was probably right. But whatever it hadn't been invited in, so it was just hanging out outside, reminding us it was still there every few nights. I dug up what was left of the apple and got rid of it. She immediately contacted a friend of hers, a Reiki master, to cleanse the house, which she did. The most interesting thing is that almost immediately after, the cloud of giant gnats just disappeared. It's how we had decided we would know whether or not we were in the clear. And that was it. Never will I ever bury rotten fruit on Halloween again. I stick to just leaving out the candy bowl overnight these days. To give some background information on the events to come, my family and I have lived in our current place for over a decade. My parents decided to move to the countryside, bought a plot of land, a then nondescript cow field, and built a home. We're the first people to live in our home, and there's not really any written history regarding the land we live on. The arrowheads we found in our yard when we first moved in point in a different direction, but I digress. Save for the occasional strange occurrence, mostly when my siblings and I are children growing up in the house, we lived fairly quietly in our countryside neighborhood for years. Nothing to indicate any negative vibes for the most part. Our neighbors would beg to differ, but that's not my story to tell. Now, I remember this day well because, as corny as it sounds, this happened on Halloween, 2017. I was in my final year of university, and I had clinical at a local hospital that morning. Now, my parents are paranoid people at heart, and we have a security system that they set every night religiously. Every door and every window has to be closed in order for the security system to kick in. After turning on, the security alarm will go off if any doors or windows are opened. That morning, Both my dad and I were ready to head out for the day. It was very early, maybe 5 in the morning, and being late October, it was still dark and cold outside. I'm in the kitchen when my dad starts to head out for work. He disengages the alarm and then resets it. This allows for a short 1-minute window of time before the security system turns back on. During this time, he steps out into the garage. A minute later, the alarm goes off. Now, I'm in the kitchen and I pause for a moment, thinking that was odd. My dad, having been on the other side of the garage door putting his shoes on, heard the alarm and came back inside. He figures he must have set it wrong by accident, and turns off the alarm because my mother is awake at this point and about to wake up my sisters for school. I head out shortly thereafter for clinical. A few hours into my day, my clinical instructor quickly comes up to me. She asks if I have my phone on me. As a responsible student, I had left my phone in the break room because some of my other classmates had been chewed out before for being on their phones. Without any preamble, she says that I need to call my mother. Of course, at this point, I'm mentally preparing myself for the worst. When I ask if everything is okay, she says everything is fine, but your mom just wants to make sure you're okay. I think this is an odd sentiment, but I go to the break room and check my phone to see that I have a ton of missed calls and texts. I call my mom and ask her what's up. She asks if I'm okay and I say yes, and that I already told her I had clinical early in the morning. She said that she of course knew this, but she didn't see me leave and that she found one of our dining room windows opened, just now. Our house is a ranch-style home and our dining room windows are tall enough to cover the majority of the 12-foot tall room. These windows require you to unlock 2 turn latches and then physically push up the window to open it. It's not something that can just open on its own, and we've never had any issues with loose locks. It wasn't even cracked either. It was about 3/4 of the way open, with the roll-up curtain still closed over it. It was also late October, so none of us are opening a window while it's cold and dark outside. This window opening would also explain why the security system went off in the morning. One would immediately think home invasion. However, the locks would be near impossible to unlock from the outside. There are 2 large bushes, which were undisturbed. What would also be impossible is that the screen on the windows were still intact. The screens are on the outside of the house with the prongs facing inwards. If someone indeed tried to break in, they would have to remove the screen to get to the window, somehow unlock the 2 window latches, open the window, hear the alarm go off, slam the window screen back into the frame with the prong still facing inwards, without me hearing it from the kitchen, and then run for it. So really, the only logical explanation is for the window to have been opened from the inside. And we already discussed that none of us did it. We honestly couldn't be bothered to open the windows with good weather. So, ghost? Demon? Or worse, a human. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you ever had something creepy happen to you on Halloween? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, if you have any scary stories that you'd like to be told, be sure to send them in. If you liked the video, how about leaving a thumbs up? If you loved the video, consider subscribing if you aren't already. I post regularly 3 times a week, and would love to welcome new fear seekers into the fold. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, fear seekers. I'll see you in the next video.